About the geography of Mexico. This is going to be the very first lecture that we have in our unit on Latin American geography, and for me to talk about it, we need to sort of have an idea of what is Latin America. I'm going to start off with Mexico because it's one of the largest countries. But Latin America is everything from Mexico, which is the northernmost country in Latin America. It borders the south of the United States, all the way down to um, Argentina and Chile, which are on the southern part of South America. So it's everything from Mexico all the way through Central America and South America, and that's all of Latin America and what we'll be talking about. Today we'll just be talking about the geography of Mexico because it is one of the largest countries and one of the most influential countries in Latin America, and that'll sort of get us started in the unit. Now, for Mexico, and some of you may be familiar with it, you probably imagine that Mexico's climate is hot and arid, and to a certain extent that's true. But because the Tropic of Cancer runs through Mexico, we find that it has not only tropical hot climates in the south, but also subtropical or cooler climates in the north. It's not going to be as cool as you would expect from someplace like Kansas, but it is going to be a little bit cooler than the desert that I think a lot of people picture when they think of Mexico, and we'll get to exactly why that is later on in the slide. With the slideshow, but make sure you write down subtropical and tropical because you'll want to understand what that means later. There is a dry central area between the mountains. So there are mountains on the east and western sides of Mexico, and they enclose a dry central area, and that is known as the Central Mexican Plateau or Mexican Altiplano. But you can write down Central Mexican Plateau. That's probably important to know. That is this sort of dry central region that you probably think of when you think of Mexico. The higher altitudes have wet forested regions, so that's along the mountains, and I'll talk about that more when we get to the mountain ranges. But there are also prominent wet and dry seasons. So not only is there more rainfall and forestation as a result in the mountains, but also parts of Mexico have wet and dry seasons. So they'll have seasons from June through October that will typically run very dry, and then from October until next June it'll be wet. So that's when they'll get the bulk of their rainfall. This sort of kind of creates more extreme climates than you will see some in a place like Kansas. Okay, so let's talk about the mountains first. And there are three real major mountain ranges you need to know about in Mexico, and those are the Sierra Madre, Occidental, Oriental, and Del Sur. So there are three different mountain ranges. All of them are known as the Sierra Madre, but they have three different actual ranges within the Sierra Madre. The Occidental are on the western side. Occidental means west. So this is the Western Mountain Range, and they are, it's really cut through by rivers. And so what that does is it creates lots of Grand Canyon-like structures, where you've got like lots of different cutouts and things like that. And then what's happened is the canyons that are created end up having mineral deposits in them, and that's where Mexico gets some of its natural resources. There's one major canyon known as Copper Canyon. It's called as such because, as you might expect, it has a lot of copper in it. And at certain points, that's actually deeper than the Grand Canyon, but that's the major canyon, and that's on the western side of Mexico. This mountain range is really hard to navigate because it's really rocky, but then you've got these canyons. It makes it very, very difficult to get across this sort of region. On the eastern side, so facing the Gulf of Mexico, you have the Sierra Madre Oriental. This has lots of biodiversity, and what biodiversity means, and this is going to be one of your vocab words in this unit, biodiversity is a variety of wildlife and both plants and animals. So I want you to write a variety of wildlife. Biodiversity means that you've got a lot of different types of animals, and the Sierra Madre Oriental is really good for this. That's where you're going to get not so many rivers cutting through it, and so because the mountains are more continuous, you can have long swaths of pine oak forest. So up in these higher altitudes, it's easier because it's cooler and because it gets more rainfall to have these sort of like oak forests that you don't see in the middle of the country on the plateau. So that's the Sierra Madre Oriental, and that's on the eastern side of the country. And then finally, you've got the Sierra Madre del Sur, which is in the south. And this is going to be a lot like your Sierra Madre Oriental, and it's going to run along the south towards Guatemala, but that is going to be a little bit warmer because um, it is in the southern part of the country. The Sierra Madre del Sur runs into this other mountain range known as the Trans-Mexican Volcanic Belt, which are also called the Sierra Nevada. They're called the Sierra Nevada because they go taller than the other mountains and they become snowy, and that's what Sierra Nevada means. And they have pine forests as well. And one of the things that contributes to that is the volcanic activity results in a richer soil. So it's easier for plant life to grow here. And then because plant life can grow here, we can also get more wildlife, more animal life. And so that's because of the volcanic activity. But that's the Trans-Mexican volcanic belt, and that's primarily on the southern part. And I'm going to show you how. So you may remember from earlier science classes, but plate tectonics is sort of this idea that there are all these different sort of like pieces of rock on Earth sitting on top of the magma that are pushing up against one another. And in Mexico, you can see Mexico is right here, and it sits on top of the North American plate, but it also pushes up against the Caribbean plate right here in its southern portions. Okay, and then it also pushes against the Cocos plate here. So along this part where it pushes up, there's going to be more volcanic activity here, and then also in the southern part here, there's going to be more volcanoes because that's where the plates are pushing up, and that can cause volcanic activity. And that's where Mexico gets its volcanoes from. Volcanoes aren't necessarily active, but it can lead to earthquakes, and it also can result in dormant or extinct volcanoes have previously had volcanic activity, and that will result in a better quality of soil from the volcanic ash that can help things grow, like in the Sierra Nevada. That's where you get those pine oak forests. So along the same lines as the mountains, we also need to talk about the rivers. You're going to want to know about two major rivers as far as the political boundaries that we'll talk about later go, but the sort of physical boundaries of Texas or Mexico are formed by the Rio Bravo in the north, which forms the border with Texas. It's known as the Rio Grande in the United States, but it's called the Rio Bravo in Mexico. And that's what forms the southern border of Texas, the northern border of Mexico. And then in the south, you've got the Grijalva Usumacinta River, and it's responsible for most of the wildlife in Mexico. Over 60% of the different species feed off of this particular river. It forms the border between Mexico and Guatemala in the south of the country. Two other rivers I want to touch on are the Balsas and the Coatzacoalcos. They are very, very polluted. They run through 5 different states, the Balsas does, and the Coatzacoalcos is the most polluted river in the country, and it serves for Veracruz and Oaxaca, which are two of the major industrial centers of the country. We're going to talk about that more when we talk about cultural geography, but what's ended up happening is these rivers have a lot of pollution runoff, and so they're actually contaminated and toxic, and they don't support as much life, but they're very important because they run through major population centers. While we're talking about water sources, I want to talk about the coasts, and then the coasts of Mexico are the border two major bodies of water. To the east, you've got the Gulf of Mexico, and then also the Caribbean Sea in the southern portions. And then to the west, you've got the Pacific Ocean. There are two major peninsulas in Mexico, and you'll remember that a peninsula is a body of land that has three sides facing water. So an island is a body of land that's surrounded by water. A peninsula has 3 of its sides. surrounded by water. And I forgot to highlight that as a vocab word, but go ahead and write peninsula down and write down that definition because it's important to know. The two major peninsulas here are Yucatan, which is on the eastern side, and that's where you're going to find Cancun, if you're familiar with that. Again, we'll talk about the cities in the cultural geography portion. And then Baja, which is the Baja Peninsula, which is on the western side and borders California, and that also borders the Pacific Ocean. Both the Yucatan and the Baja have desert portions to them, but they also provide major cultural centers because they're bordered by water. So those are the two peninsulas you need to know about. Okay, now for natural resources, Mexico is actually somewhat rich in natural resources. They have many petroleum exports. So essentially, on the eastern side, there's a lot of oil, both offshore, so from the ocean, and then also land mining. And so what they'll do is they dig up the oil and then they ship that off. So Mexico makes a lot of money from petroleum. You'll remember the copper deposits I talked about with regards to the Copper Canyon. Those are there as a mineral deposit, and then also silver. The Mexican Altiplano, or the Mexican Plateau, has silver located throughout it. And we've got a map at the end, and so I'll sort of show you where these are located. And then lastly, there's coal sprinkled throughout the country, and coal is another export, although it's not as major as the copper or the petroleum. So you do need to know those. Okay, so I want to go over and sort of review the stuff we've talked about now that we've got the map up here. So hopefully you can kind of tie this all together. Here are the Sierra Madre Occidental. If you can follow my mouse cursor, it runs down here. Here's the Sierra Madre del Sur, and then also this is where the cutoff for the Caribbean plate is, and so that's where a lot of those volcanoes are located. And then here are the Sierra Madre Oriental. This is the Gulf of Mexico over here. Here's the Caribbean Sea, and then this is the Pacific Ocean. This is the Baja Peninsula, and this is the Yucatan Peninsula, and you can see the Yucatan is surrounded by the north, the west, and the east with water. Baja is surrounded on the south, the east, and the west with water as well. Here is the Rio Grande, or the Rio Bravo. So this is the Rio Bravo in Mexico. And then down here, you can see the, I can't remember how to pronounce the name, the river that forms the border with Guatemala. Here's Guatemala, and we'll talk about that later. This is the Central Mexican Plateau, or the Mexican Altiplano, and that's where you're going to find a lot of the cities, and it's also where you're going to find a lot of that desert that you probably imagine when you think of Mexico. Again, we're looking at a map, and so I just want to go ahead and hammer in the points. This map has a scale, which includes its source. This is the person that created it. It has a compass, and it's labeled. There is no legend on this map, so they didn't include all 5 elements, and so that's not the greatest thing, but it is here. Okay, I do want to go back to this idea of tropical and subtropical while I've got you looking at the map. You can see here, this is the Tropic of Cancer, which is at 23.5 degrees north latitude. You can write that down, 23.5. The Tropic of Cancer forms the northern boundary for what is known as the tropical climate zone. Between here and the Tropic of Capricorn, which is at 23.5 degrees south, and we'll talk about when we talk about South America, is what's known as the tropical zone. And anything located within here is considered tropical. That's going to have your higher temperatures, and that's going to also give you the sort of climate things that you need for rainforests. Above here is subtropical. Everything between the Tropic of Cancer and the 38th parallel, which is 38 degrees north latitude, is going to be what's considered subtropical, or below the tropical temperature. So here it's going to be hotter, here it's going to be cooler, and then this sort of, like you can see, splits the country in half. This is where the sort of cooler part is, and this is where the warmer part is. And so that's a really important for understanding the distinction between the two sort of climate zones. That should give you an idea of what the physical geography is like, and give you a good idea of what you're dealing with as far as that's concerned. The last thing I want to touch on is that down here in this in Chiapas and Tabasco, the two southern states here, there is a rainforest, and can exist because there's a lot more. There's a lot more rainfall on the down here, and they get quite a bit of rain every year. And then this rainforest goes into Guatemala and Belize, and that rainforest is where you're going to end up finding actually a lot of the Mayan civilization, which we'll talk more about whenever we touch on cultural geography. That should sort of give you an idea of what we're looking for. Go ahead and take notes and submit the notes over Blackboard so that I know that you've done them. And then that should be good enough for this particular lecture. I hope that you understand it. And as always, if you have any questions, just let me know.